Greetings to you all, our viewers and listeners living and working in different parts of the world. Welcome to yet another episode of The Conversation. My name is Anotida Chikumbu and I'm your host. And today I'm excited to have Dr. Reuben Loffman, who is a lecturer in African history at Queen Mary University of London. He has published articles on the history of the Democratic Republic of Congo in journals such as the International Journal of African Historical Studies and African Studies, and he has offered political commentary on Congolese politics for media outlets such as Al-Jazeera. Today we are set to discuss his book, Church, State, and Colonialism in Southeastern Congo. This book was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2019. Dr. Reuben Loffman, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. I'm very much happy to have you. How is your day going so far?
Very good, very good. Rather damp, but otherwise okay.
Awesome, awesome. I lastly saw you in 2019. It's been long. It's been quite a while.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, and I remember the time that I lastly saw you, you were doing the research for this book, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, just finishing up. That's right. Yes, absolutely.
That is wonderful. Congratulations on this.
Thank you ever so much. I appreciate your congratulations.
That is so great. That is so great. And so let us get started with the conversation for today. My first question for you, your book talks about the relationship between the Catholic missionaries and the state during the colonial times in the history of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Can you just briefly talk about what this relationship was like, the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Free State, and then later on the Belgian Congo from 1890 to 1962?
Absolutely. So what my book did was to try and look again at this relationship. So traditionally, according to authors such as the now late Crawford Young, the Catholic missionaries had an extremely close relationship with the Belgian Free State administration and latterly the Belgian colonial administration. And this relationship was described by Crawford Young as seamless. So in a sense, the Catholic missionaries were part and parcel of Belgian colonialism, that they were just another branch in many respects of the colonial administration. And that worked really all the way up until decolonization in 1960. Now, what my book says is it's far more complicated than that. And what I do is to build on the work of Marvin Markowitz, as well as several others who talk about the relationship being quite fractious. So what was the relationship like in terms of the Free State is an interesting question, because of course Leopold II actually wants to consolidate Catholic power in the Congo, particularly in a relationship, a deal he does with the Pope in 1906. But before then, there's actually quite a lot of Protestant power, of course, in the Congo Free State. But this relationship between Leopold and the Catholics gets closer and closer. Leopold supports the Scoutists, a Belgian headquartered Catholic mission organization. And he particularly likes them because they are Belgian, and he fears that if, for example, a French Spiritan congregation becomes powerful, then it could be France that annexes part of the Congo Free State. So Leopold is extremely sensitive, not just to the exigencies of religious politics, but also, of course, the nationality of missionaries and the nationality of Catholic missionaries as well. Once we get to the period of Belgian colonialism, the formal colonialization from 1908 to 1960, we see again generally a very close relationship, and the Belgian colonial administration typically, not exclusively, but typically preferring Catholic missionaries because it feels that Catholic missionaries will be far easier to control, that they are accountable to a hierarchy in the context of the church, and they are people who would be allies of the Belgian administration. So what I say is that yes, this relationship is very close. The Belgian missionaries did occasionally collaborate with the state, but they also retained their own agenda, and at times this clashed with that of the colonial administration. So this was a very tight, very close relationship, but wasn't always seamless, as Crawford Young suggests.
That is wonderful. Thank you very much for that. I see that you decided to use the case study of the Congolo territory to examine the ideas and the themes that you raise. Uh, what was the central significance of this territory, and what was the status quo of the political and economic structures of institutions and structures of this Congolo state before the coming in of these Belgian forces?
Fantastic question. And I think the first point was that initially I was drawn to Congo because it was a very cosmopolitan territory. There are a number of different cultures present in Congolo, whether that's Hemba, whether that's Zanzibari, whether that's Luba, particularly Luba Katanga, of course, as distinct from Luba Kasai, as well as, for example, the Twa people. So there are a number of different cultures in Congo, and that's what drew me to it initially. In terms of its relationship with the colonial state, it's also pretty interesting because it has a very, in many cases, distant but yet close relationship. So at times it's very distant and at times it's very close. So for example, in the 1920s, it was seen as increasingly as a breadbasket of the Katanga region of Southeastern Congo as a whole. It becomes a vanguard cotton producing province or territory, I should say, later in the colonial period. And it goes through phases where it's neglected by the administration, or it's ignored or not particularly seen as a particularly important territory, but it also has these periods where it's seen as very important. In terms of your question about what was there before, a very important question. And here I think the most important point is that it was the site of an incomplete invasion by Zanzibari slaver merchants. So these merchants would typically speak Swahili. They would be financed by Zanzibari interests, and they would be interested in extorting slaves from, for example, territories under the control of the Songye or the Luba Katanga or the Hemba, and they would be then interned in camps such as in Kasongo, and then they'd be taken back to Zanzibar for sale, or indeed the Shambars on the eastern coast. Now, what I said about the incomplete nature of this conquest is important because you have the spread of some Swahili Zanzibari culture. This is the case in some areas of Congo, but others you don't. So you have the continuation of some traditions in some cases where you didn't get, for example, a complete Zanzibari colonization. So that makes political authority very, very contentious, where you have, for example, salt or chiefs who have been installed by the Zanzibari slavers, who are seen by many of their subjects to be illegitimate, and other chiefs, of course, who have pre-colonial heritage, who were not necessarily subject to the rule of the Zanzibari. So there is a very, very important political dimension to this incomplete and in many cases contentious conquest of the Zanzibar. Of course, every conquest is contentious. This one, like all others, was very contentious and had echoes later into the colonial era.
Oh, that is wonderful. That is wonderful. What clearly comes out of your book, a thorough reading of it, the central tenet that clearly comes out is that the church was successfully able to impose itself on the territory of the Congolo. But this is against a background against which the Belgian government is considered to be all powerful, in as much as its influence on the people and on the territories was concerned. Why was this so? Why was the church able to successfully impose its institution on the territory of the Congo?
Thank you. Yes. Well, really, because of the early phase of the Congo Free State, and that is to say that while Leopold II was very interested in the boundaries between, for example, what was British Central Africa, the Rhodesias, and his Congo Free State, he was very keen to put troops there. He was very keen on putting troops in certain areas. Congolo was really left to a very skeletal staff, if any staff, and it was subject to very little colonial occupation. That is to say, until really the early 20th century. So while it was the scene of some of the Swahili or the Zanzibari Belgio wars, wars between a number of different parties in the late 19th century, really it was left outside of the main thrust of the administration. So the church took advantage of that administrative lack of presence to make itself a very, very imposing infrastructure. And that was vital in this early period, where people like Victor Rowlands, who is a white father, someone from the Society of Missionaries of Africa, who decided to go outside of the purview of the administration, or outside of the administration's main bases, to form a outstation in Sola. And this was in the Congo Territory, as you described. So the church took advantage of a lack of state presence in order to build this imposing infrastructure. And I need to make a distinction here between church infrastructure, that is to say the outstations, the chapels, the schools, and the church's control over people's consciousness, because often the church can't quite stamp its own cultural values onto those that it wants to. So there is a lack of hegemony, if you like, but there is an imposing infrastructure, exactly as you say, in the face of an administration that's often thought to be extremely dense in Central Africa.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wonderful. Although this church-state relations seemed to be far from cordial throughout the time period that we examine, it seems that at some point at which John Lonsdale describes as the second colonial occupation, there seems to have been a change, and there was more collaboration between the church and the state. Why was this so?
So John Lonsdale and Anthony Lowe's term about the second colonial occupation is very important, because this was replicated not only in British Africa but also in Belgian Africa, and there was a number of investment and development projects launched by the colonial state. Now, crucially, after the Second World War, what you tended to have was the church loses a lot of those missionaries who were there at the very beginning of the 20th century, like Victor Rowland. So those people who have this vision of a Christian kingdom in Kongolo and other areas which now constitute the province of Tanganyika, those people have now retired and in some cases died. And what you have are missionaries who come to the Congo in the face of administration which is very, very present, unlike the administration you saw in Kongolo in the turn of the century. So they see an administration that's very powerful. Likewise, the administration sees the church as very valuable allies, particularly in the sphere of education and medicine. So, for example, their development projects hinge on African intermediaries. Those intermediaries are often trained in Catholic Church schools. So the church is viewed by the state as a key ally. It's also viewed as an institution that doesn't have any pretensions towards creating a theocracy anymore. That dream has gone. The church has now found itself in position in the colonial state. And what I say in the book, and I think is true, is that Crawford Young saw this when he went to the archives and he projected that late colonial state-church relationship back into the early 20th and late 19th century. And that's what I've sought to unpack. But certainly the church and the state were very closely allied in that late colonial period, precisely because of this developmentalism, which was so crucial in the first 10-year plan, which was launched by the Belgian administration from 1949. But even you see the relationship between the church and state cementing a little before that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for that response. This is so interesting. Your book looks at these themes, at these areas from let's say the point at which the Congolese were colonized up until the time they were decolonized and received independence. What could have possibly been the impact of church-state relations on the process of decolonization itself, given given the impact and influence that the church had as well as the state?
It's a massive question. I could talk all day about that question. It's fantastic. I think I'll say a few observations, and they primarily are the fact that they were colored by the Katangese secession. So from 1960 to 1963, you had a secession in which Moise Tshombe and the Confederation of Katangese tribes sought to make Katanga a separate state. And of course, church-state relations were colored by that political process and, of course, military process as well. So the church really tried to play a very important balancing act between trying to placate nationalists, whereas also trying to placate the Katangese administration. In many ways, it tacitly preferred the Katangese state because of the fact that that would keep a lot of what was there before the same. So, for example, those companies that were headquartered in Europe would remain very powerful under the Katangese secessionist government versus a potential Lumumbist government in which you'd see a socialist revolution take place. At least that was the fear of the church. So many congregants, who had been schooled by the church feared an overthrow of everything that they had worked towards. That is to say, places and positions of responsibility within the colonial state. So ironically, they actually voted for the Katangese secession. They voted for Konakat, and that's very significant that the church didn't necessarily brainwash people. I think that that model is untrue, but what the church did was to provide social mobility through education, and that was what a number of my informants actually feared would go should the Katangese secession fail and should a Lumumbist administration succeed. So the church had a very big influence, I'd say, on Kongolo itself, yet what happened is the territory was split. Many in the territory wanted a Lumumbist administration, and so what my book suggests is that where you had more church presence, you had far more Konakat support versus in areas such as the south, and in particular in the southwest, where you had fewer church buildings, particularly the Catholic Church. There was more sympathy for Lumumba, and those circumstances briefly and broadly mapped onto each other. And the other point to say about this is that the Protestant Church, which was particularly after 1906 and Leopold's discrimination and the Belgian colonial administration's discrimination against Protestants in the main, the Protestant Church graduates would often be more sympathetic towards nationalism. And so again, the Protestant Church regions in Congolo, often though not always, were sympathetic to people outside of the secession. So that is a very, very brief exposition of how church-state relationships fared in decolonization. I want to finish, though, with the point that, of course, many missionaries, Puritan missionaries in particular, fell victim to the, I suppose, the aftermath of Lumumba's assassination and the militants that came to the Congo Territory in 1962 were responsible for killing a number of missionaries of the Puritan, the Holy Ghost Fathers order. So that was society. So that was a very important moment, I think. So church-state relationships were dramatically affected by decolonization, and I hope those observations give you some indication of just how profound those changes were.
Of course. So what happened to the Kongolo during the time of the Katangese secession?
So really, Congolo was very, very torn by the Katangese secession, in that once you have the secession declared, a lot of the territory was subject to Luba, in particular Luba Katanga protesters, although in the Hemba literature they're seen as militia. So there's a lot of propaganda here, and for a historian trying to distinguish is difficult, but you do have those who sympathize with the Leopoldville government, now Kinshasa, starting to take over. And then the Katangese administration, once it's actually got its army together, that takes time. It takes time to create that army, a very professionalized outfit it was too. They push the militants out of Congolo, only for them to come back once the secession starts and the army starts to focus on areas to the south. So we have this constant changing, Congolo invaded by different armies at different times. And so it's an extremely violent experience that this territory has. And after you get once you get into 1962, you start to see at the beginning of 1962, at the end of 1961, that Congolo starts to form part of an administration that is separate from the Katangese secession, and you start to get the Lualaba province, which is declared, and that is loyal to the Leopoldville administration, the administration of later Patrice Lumumba and his successors. and that is opposed to Moise Tshombe, but that eventually gets beaten back. And once we get to 1962, it's Antoine Gizenga, Patrice Lumumba's deputy prime minister, who believes that he should take over the Congo. His militia come and they are responsible, at least, or they are very implicated in the invasion of Kongolo in January 1962. And that basically is the end of the Katanga secession and in Kongolo. And then, of course, we know the history of the UN as it fights, in many cases, street by street in the south of what was Katanga, ending the secession by the 21st of January 1963. So Kongolo has this really violent relationship with the secession, and it's very difficult. And of course, it creates a lot of refugees, and that's very frightening. And it was a very, very traumatic experience.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for this, Dr. Reuben Loffman. You mentioned in the book that you received some support from the Economic and Social Research Council for the completion of this project. Can you just briefly talk about this before we finish? How is the fund administered, and how can one get support from the Economic and Social Research Council? So just as to let other academics who are interested in research to know about this and to know how it's administered.
Yeah, so essentially, I did my doctorate quite some time. I finished my doctorate in 2011, and I started in 2007. So this is quite some time ago. So I have to apologize to your listeners and viewers if what I say is inaccurate, because I haven't gone back to the rigmarole and the administrative headwork. So I have to post that caveat before I begin. But I'd say that usually, it's not exclusively, but usually for postgraduate students, the ESRC, as well as other funding councils, the ESRC is part of a number of research councils in the UK, and the research councils disperse money to a university who would then interview candidates, or would then have a process by which they would appoint a candidate to a particular PhD studentship. So when I was doing my doctorate, what would often happen would be that students would actually apply with their institution to the funding council, and it would be on a much more individual basis, whereas now lots of the fund, I believe, is managed by university institutions. That'd be a university would say, there's a doctorate in this, do you want to apply? And so it's up to the candidate to apply if the doctorate is of interest to them. So that's how the doctoral funding tends to work nowadays. It could be the case, and I'd encourage your viewers to look at the website of the ESRC, just in case I'm wrong, and that they can make an individual application with, for example, a supervisor that they want to work with. That might still be an option, but typically the funding councils give money to universities in order to create studentships. And that is how things work out now. So I'd encourage students to look at sites such as jobs.ac.uk, and to look at sites where PhD studentships are advertised. Again, it's been a while since I actually applied for my doctoral funding, so I'd say to students there might be other kinds of internet forums where they can be seen, but jobs.ac.uk I believe is one, and students can see what studentships are being offered by which universities, and then the idea is to apply to that university.
That is wonderful. Dr. Reuben Loffman, thank you very much for your participation. Viewers and listeners, this was Dr. Reuben Loffman, who is a senior lecturer at Queen Mary University of London. His book, Church, State and Colonialism in Southeastern Congo from 1890 to 1962 was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2019. I'm going to paste a link to the direct access of the book on the comment section below so that everybody gets to see it. This was wonderful. Dr. Reuben Loffman, thank you for joining me. This is the platform where I get to sit with established academics to have a discussion of their outstanding publications. I believe this was an outstanding one. It says here that it was shortlisted for the Ecclesiastical History Society 2020 Book Prize. This was exciting. Thank you very much for your participation, and have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, you too. Thank you.
That is wonderful.